An equally great way to quit wasting so much time is to eliminate time wasters in the first place. Meet yourself from the future. Takeaway. The more you see your future self, you only in the future, as a stranger, the more likely you are to give your future self the same workload that you would give a stranger and put things off to tomorrow. It's important to get in touch with your future self by doing things like sending a letter to future you, creating a future memory, or even downloading an app that will show you what you look like in the future. An awkward letter. About 1 week ago, I received a letter in the mail. Receiving an actual letter is odd itself, but to make things even odder, it was from myself. Here's the letter in its entirety, which I sent to myself 8 months ago. Hi man, right now you're kind of at a crossroads, unsure of what career, money, life, and other choices to make. I'd like to fast forward several months to see how things turn out, I'm not gonna lie. But right now, you're surrounded by 8 brand new friends and you're happy. In the fray of uncertainty. Everything is good because you're surrounded by people you care for and that care for you. I'm not sure how things will be with Arden, I guess pretty good at this rate, but you are happy to hear her voice today. I'm not sure how healthy you'll be, but right now you're in the best shape of your life. I'm also not sure, sense a common theme here, how happy, positive, mindful, or anything else you'll be. But I guess that's the beauty of it all. It's a cliche, but you believe this. Happiness is nothing more than coming to terms with how things change. I hope you're happy and doing great. At this rate, I know you are. Love, Chris. For the last 5 years, I've volunteered for an organization named Camp Quality. Camp Quality is a worldwide charity that puts on week-long summer camps designed to help kids who suffer from cancer feel like kids again. Volunteers are paired up with a camper, and we hang out with them for a week, and every once in a while throughout the year. In addition to the week-long camps, the organization puts on a yearly 4-day leadership camp for teenagers who suffered from cancer when they were kids. The camp lets people like myself share what we've learned so the campers can navigate some of the teen experiences we've already gone through. One of the activities at last year's leadership camp, whether you were a camper or a volunteer, was to write a letter to your future self. Even though my letter is a little awkward to look back on, I still remember the activity being valuable for a very specific reason. We hardly ever think about our future selves. The difference between you and Taylor Swift. If you were to lie down in an fMRI machine, a machine that measures your brain activity by looking at changes in blood flow, and you thought about your future self and then thought about a total stranger like Taylor Swift, you would notice something peculiar when you looked at the 2 scans. They wouldn't be all that different. Hal Hirschfield, a professor at UCLA's Anderson School of Management, has conducted this exact study and found that while the average participant's brain scan of his or her present self and a stranger's scan varied quite a bit, the participant's brain scan of his or her future self and a total stranger's scan were almost identical. This has a huge impact on your productivity. The more you see yourself like a stranger, the more likely you are to give your future self the same workload that you would give a stranger, and the more likely you are to put things off to tomorrow for your future self to do. Since you see yourself from the future as no different from a stranger, you also see her or him as less tired, busy, and more focused and disciplined than the version of you that's listening to this book. And while in some ways that will be true, particularly as you begin to implement the tactics in this audiobook, you'll obviously have a lot more in common with yourself today than with a total stranger. The more disconnected you are from your future self, the more likely you are to do things like give your future self more work than you would give your present self. Agree to unproductive or pointless meetings far off in the future. Keep 10 uninspiring documentaries around on your PVR that you'll get around to watching. Continually transfer aversive tasks to tomorrow's to-do list and save less money for retirement. If I asked if you wanted to sign up for a marathon that's 10 weeks from now, chances are you wouldn't agree to it. That would require a ton of work over the next several months to build up to running 26.2 miles. But if I asked if you wanted to sign up for a marathon that's 2.5 years from now, though you still may not agree, chances are you'll feel a lot less resistance to the idea. You're a lot more likely to be attracted to the grand idea of running a marathon than you are to think about what your future self will have to do to get there. Surprisingly, though our limbic system takes over when we procrastinate, the prefrontal cortex is responsible for us not taking our future selves into account when we make decisions. Getting in touch. To understand how we think about our future selves, Hal Hershfield conducted a fascinating experiment. He teamed up with professional animators to set up a simulator that showed participants a live 3D model of what they will look like when they retire. If a student moved even slightly, opened his or her mouth to speak, or turned one way or another, the model did the exact same thing in real time. After Hershfield asked students a bunch of questions in the simulator, he gave them a task: allocate $1,000 between their present-day selves and for themselves at retirement. After the experiment, he discovered something remarkable. Students who stepped into the simulator saved more than twice as much for retirement than those who didn't. Quote, "It's so easy to commit your future self to things your current self wouldn't want to do," he says. We call this a planning fallacy. He explains that you have the best of intentions when you make commitments for your future self, but that your future self usually gets the short end of the stick. But it's part of our biological makeup. Quote, "Evolutionarily speaking, when you could be eaten by a lion at any moment, saving for the future doesn't make much sense," he says. But it's easier to travel through time and get in touch with your future self than you think. I've already revealed my favorite way to get in touch with my future self: through the rule of 3. In the rule of 3, your future self takes center stage. By mentally fast-forwarding to the end of the day and thinking about what you want to accomplish, you activate the planning centers in your prefrontal cortex while you also step into the shoes of your future self. And you do the same when you plan out your 3 accomplishments at the start of every week. After coming across Hershfield's research, I conducted a number of experiments to get in touch with my future self. Here are my favorite 3. 1. Fire up Aging Booth. While hiring a programmer to create a 3D virtual reality simulator is probably out of your price range, I personally love an app called Aging Booth, which transforms a picture of your face into what you will look like in several decades. There are also other apps like it, like Merrill Edge's web app that shows you a live avatar of what you'll look like at retirement. Go to faceretirement.merrilledge.com. Aging Booth is my favorite of them all, and it's available for both Android and iOS, and it's free. On the website for this book, productivityprojectbook.com, you can see what to expect out of the app. I've framed a picture of myself that hangs above my computer in my office, where I see it every day. Visitors are usually freaked out. 2. Send a letter to your future self. Like the letter I wrote at camp, writing and sending a letter to yourself in the future is a great way to bridge the gap between you and your future self. I frequently use futureme.org to send emails to myself in the future, particularly when I see myself being unfair to future me. 3. Create a future memory. I'm not a fan of hocus-pocus visualizations, so I hope this doesn't sound like one. In her brilliant book, The Willpower Instinct, Kelly McGonigal recommends creating a memory of yourself in the future, like one where you don't put off a report you're procrastinating on, or one where you read 10 interesting books because you staved off the temptation of binge-watching 3 seasons of House of Cards on Netflix. Simply imagining a better, more productive version of yourself down the line has been shown to be enough to motivate you to act in ways that are helpful for your future self. By the way, at the end of most winters, I leave a $20 bill in my pocket, which I completely forget about until I reach into my winter coat pocket the next year. While it's important not to be unfair to your future self, one of the most awesome things you can do is treat your future self. Whether that means saving for the future, saying no to eating pizza tonight, working out, learning calculus, putting on sunscreen, flossing, breathing more, or leaving some money in your coat pocket to find 6 months later. You'll feel incredible later on. The time traveling challenge. Time required, 10 minutes. Energy and focus required, 4 out of 10. Value, 7 out of 10. Fun, 9 out of 10. What you'll get out of it. You'll become less likely to put things off until tomorrow, foisting them on your future self because you no longer see your future self as a stranger. When you put something off or waste time, you're almost always being unfair to your future self. Before you get in touch with your future self, it's worth pausing for a few seconds to think about how tight you two are in the first place. According to Hirschfeld, everyone identifies differently with their future self. He calls how closely you identify with your future self continuity. Before getting in touch with your future self, ask yourself, on a scale of 0 to 10, how closely do you identify with future you? After you've identified where you fall, if you find yourself a bit estranged from your future self, invest in connecting with future you, either by downloading an app like Aging Booth, sending a letter to future you through a site like futureme.org, or if you're feeling particularly adventurous, by imagining your future self and creating a future memory. Trust me, you'll thank yourself later. The internet can destroy your productivity if you're not careful. The best way I have found to prevent the internet from wasting my time has been to simply disconnect from it when working on a high-impact or ugly task, and to disconnect as much as possible throughout the day. After getting over the initial withdrawal, the calm and productivity you'll experience will be unlike anything else. Technology is freaking awesome. The very first productivity experiment I conducted during my project, which was also one of the most memorable ones, involved using my smartphone for just an hour a day for 3 months. Throughout the experiment, traveling around with a notepad in one pocket and my iPhone in the other, I meticulously noted whenever I used my phone, which usually happened in 15-minute chunks of time, so I wouldn't go over the hour limit. I love running experiments like this, where I remove an element from my work and observe how my routines, habits, and rituals are affected, because I can observe how different aspects of my work, like using my smartphone and constantly being connected, either help or hinder my productivity. While humans have evolved at quite a consistent rate over the last 2.5 million years, in the last couple of centuries, technology has progressed at a hugely accelerated rate. Moore's Law, which says that the number of transistors on a chip will double every 2 years, has held true for more than 50 years. And today's run-of-the-mill smartphone packs more punch into 200 grams than an entire multi-room supercomputer did just a few decades ago. And humanity has, of course, advanced alongside this revolution. While the average life expectancy throughout the world hovered at 25 years from 5000 BCE through 1820, after the Industrial Revolution, our life expectancy began accelerating. It now sits at 80 years in the United States. But I would argue that of all the technology we have, the internet has changed our life the most. The internet, along with the technology it has inspired, has flattened the world and connected more people than anything that came before it. Plus, when you tap your smartphone a very specific way, a pizza man shows up at your door 20 minutes later. Wrap your head around this. If you were to send today's iPhone back in time to 2 decades ago, people would think you were a witch because the device would be indistinguishable from magic. Try to imagine what internet device will exist 10 or 20 years from now that is so advanced that if we brought it back to today, you would think the same. This is the kind of stuff that goes on in my head all day long. Please send help. As far as human history is concerned, the internet and the technologies it spawned are a godsend. But because humans, and the newer parts of our brain like the prefrontal cortex, have continued to evolve in a linear fashion alongside these technologies, at least as far as productivity is concerned, it's made us unprepared to deal with how disruptive these technologies can be to our work. The internet can absolutely obliterate your productivity if you're not careful. The zen of disconnecting. A huge part of me is relieved that I didn't keep a time log before my smartphone experiment. Working deliberately is hard enough without the internet, and if I had to wager a guess, I would say that I procrastinated 10 hours or more each week before actively disconnecting every day. And that wouldn't be above the norm. Once you account for how much time you spend online, how often your work gets interrupted when you're online, Chapter 19, and the inefficiencies that come along with multitasking online, Chapter 20, it's safe to say that the internet is one of the biggest disruptors of our productivity. The internet is so distracting that I've dedicated an entire part of this book to dealing with the distractions it sends our way. Our brains simply aren't equipped to deal with how distracting it is. If they were, we wouldn't be drowning in a sea of emails, notifications, phone calls, and buzzes, vibrations, and sounds. But the internet also impacts your productivity in a second way. That's, on the surface, pretty easy to overlook. Every day, it leads you to waste an insane amount of time. Although the first few weeks of my smartphone experiment were admittedly quite rough, I would often habitually reach for my phone in my pocket when it wasn't there, or feel a phantom vibration in my leg, even when my phone was turned off. I quickly settled into a new equilibrium and got accustomed to how peaceful I felt when I disconnected. I still used my laptop to write, do research, and conduct interviews, but every day I felt progressively more liberated from the shiny black rectangle that used to be attached at my hip throughout the day. After I survived the first few weeks of the experiment, I felt as though I had cleared a bend. A whole new expansive focus and clarity opened up for me, and I was able to dive much deeper into what I had to get done every day. While the internet is fun and stimulating, it will almost always try to tempt you away from working on the highest impact tasks you identified in part 1 of the audiobook. Compared to your high impact tasks, the internet is drop dead sexy. It's one of the least boring, frustrating, and difficult things out there, and it's also insanely rewarding and in an immediate way. A deadly combination for fostering addiction and procrastination. Oh, and structure. The internet has seeped into almost every area of our life, so much so that it's almost impossible to go a day without it. Despite how good your intentions at the beginning of the day, next to the internet, your high-impact tasks often don't stand a chance. The best way I have found to prevent the internet from wasting my time has been to simply disconnect from it when working on a demanding or unappealing task. Although that isn't always realistic, every person I know has periods of time every day when he or she can disconnect. After getting over the withdrawal that will set in over the first few weeks, the calm and productivity you'll experience will be unlike anything else. As I write these words, my smartphone is in another room, and the computer I'm writing these very words on is totally disconnected from the internet. It's just past 11 a.m. I woke up naturally just before 7 this morning, and over the last 4 hours, I've been connected to the internet for a total of an hour. It's not that I dislike the internet, just the opposite. The internet is one of my favorite things on the planet. I simply value my productivity too much to stay connected all the time, especially when I'm working on something important. A recent study from IDC, a US market research company, found that 80% of 18 to 44-year-olds check their smartphones within the first 15 minutes of waking up. I used to do this too, except I took the ritual up several notches. After I woke up, I would immediately reach for my phone and then mindlessly bounce around between my favorite apps in a stimulation-fueled feedback loop for about 30 minutes, continuously bouncing around between Twitter, email, Facebook, Instagram, and several news websites until I snapped out of my trance. Today, my morning routine couldn't be more different or more productive. Every day I shut my smartphone completely off between 8 p.m. and 8 a.m., one of my favorite daily rituals, so I can ease into and out of each day without wasting valuable time. This is especially powerful at the end of the day, when I have less willpower to resist distractions. And whenever I can, I switch my smartphone and laptop into airplane mode to hunker down on my most unattractive and high-impact tasks. The internet is arguably the most powerful thing we have ever invented, and in the coming years and decades, it will continue to shape the way we live and work in ways we can't imagine. But despite its power and its ability to serve you a never-ending stream of kitten pictures at your beck and call, as far as productivity is concerned, it's a dish that's best served in small doses. The world's largest candy store. In the same Salary.com survey, where 26% of people surveyed openly admitted to wasting at least 2 hours every day, participants named the internet as their biggest overall time waster by a massive margin. The runners-up? Too many meetings and conference calls, dealing with annoying coworkers, and returning pointless emails. But while this figure may not surprise you, maybe the most damning stat comes from another study Tim Pitchell conducted, where he discovered that participants spent an average of 47% of their time online procrastinating. In his book, he calls this figure a, quote, conservative estimate. It's easy to see why we waste so much time online. The internet is basically the world's largest candy store for your limbic system. With every tap and click, your limbic system receives a steady stream of stimulation. As Nicholas Carr put it in his eye-opening book, The Shallows, What the Internet is Doing to Our Brains, quote, the net engages all of our senses, and, to make matters worse, it engages them simultaneously. Our hands are engaged as we tap our smartphones or as we type and move our mouse around our desk. Our ears are engaged with the sounds of our keyboard and mouse, and with the sounds that come out of the speakers in front of us. And our eyes are continually stimulated as brand new text, images, and videos appear on screen. The internet hijacks your limbic system by overwhelming it. Take it from me. I've been meditating every day for the past 6 years, and even I find it hard to be mindful against the mind-numbing allure of the internet. Leveling up. Though studies like Tim's show us how much time we waste every day on the internet, they don't account for one more huge impact on your productivity. The internet tempts us to work on lower impact tasks. Though we are technically working when we do things like continually check our email, we're not as productive because we don't accomplish as much through these tasks. Disconnecting doesn't only prevent you from wasting time, it also prevents you from being tempted to work on lower impact tasks that live on the internet, like email, instant messaging, and checking social media. This makes disconnecting from the internet doubly important. Disconnecting not only lets you reclaim the time and attention you waste mindlessly, it also makes it easier to focus on your higher impact tasks. As I stepped away from the internet candy store, I discovered that without the constant temptations, I automatically worked more on my higher impact tasks. While I wasted less time and was distracted a lot less, I also stopped checking my email so often, quit refreshing Twitter, and found myself doing things like picking up a book, planning for an interview, or writing articles for my site. When I finished work for the day, whenever I stayed disconnected, I found myself doing things like meditating or making tea for my girlfriend to fill the hole in my schedule where previously I had been mindlessly wasting time online. And if I found I was ever tired after work, I actually took steps to cultivate my energy levels, part 7, instead of switching into autopilot mode. Disconnecting made my work and home lives more boring at first. My limbic system was accustomed to the constant sugar rush of the internet candy store. It took me a few weeks to adjust to the new, lower level of stimulation. But after I adjusted, I had a lot more time and attention for what was actually important. What to do about it? Unless you're a cocaine-fueled stock trader, the internet is probably the most stimulating element of your workday. At the risk of sounding like a broken record, of the 3 ingredients of productivity, time, attention, and energy, your time is the most limited. There is no way to get more of it. Disconnecting from the internet might sound dismaying, and I'll be honest, at first it is, but it's also one of the best things you can do for your productivity. Disconnecting won't only lead you to waste less time, it will also let you focus on the highest return and most meaningful tasks in your work and life. Research shows that of all of the character traits we have, impulsiveness is the one that is most highly correlated with procrastination. The more impulsive you are, the more you procrastinate, because your limbic system is that much stronger than your prefrontal cortex. Pierce Steele, who wrote the procrastination equation, calls impulsiveness, quote, the cornerstone of procrastination, and mentions that, quote, without impulsiveness, there wouldn't be such a thing as chronic procrastination. Although firing up your prefrontal cortex, either by breaking down an aversive task or connecting with your future self, is a great way to overcome procrastination, an equally great way to quit wasting so much time is to eliminate time wasters in the first place. Disconnecting from the internet is my favorite way to do that, and it will make you more productive than you think. From my experience, to become more productive, it's important to see the internet as a nicety, not a necessity. The disconnecting challenge. Time required, 30 minutes. Energy and focus required, 1 out of 10. Value, 10 out of 10. Wow. Fun, 4 out of 10. What you'll get out of it. You'll waste much less time and find yourself working on your higher impact and meaningful tasks more often, both at work and at home. Here is my simple challenge for you this chapter. Disconnect from the internet for 30 minutes tomorrow. Whether that means putting your phone on airplane mode as you eat dinner with your significant other, disconnecting from Wi-Fi as you work on one of your 3 daily tasks, or disconnecting when you have less energy so you're not tempted to waste time, disconnect and observe how much work you get done. After you observe how much work you get done when you disconnect, my guess is you'll use this strategy a ton. You may even be tempted to implement a nightly shut-off ritual. It's not always easy to observe when you're surfing the internet on autopilot, but at some point, when you snap back to attention as you find yourself staring at someone's 27th profile picture on Facebook, you'll realize that you are. When you notice yourself surfing on autopilot, I found it helpful to use that as a trigger to disconnect. This will prevent you from wasting more time and let you ease back into work mode and step back from what you're doing to work more deliberately. A word to the wise though. When you disconnect, you may feel a bit bored as your brain adjusts to the new, lower level of stimulation. That's simply your limbic system begging for the internet high that being online used to give you. To waste less time, don't listen to it. Part 3. The End of Time Management. Chapter 8. The Time Economy. Takeaway. When time was created by the Big Bang 13.8 billion years ago, the universe had a past, present, and future for the first time. Measuring time first became important during the Industrial Revolution, when factory owners needed their workers to arrive on time. Today, in the knowledge economy, if you want to become more productive, managing your time should take a back seat to how you manage your energy and attention. The beginning of time. Since the Big Bang, the universe has had a very distinct past, present, and future. It gave birth to, in sequence, the first nuclei, atoms, galaxies, and stars, and then closest to home, our own solar system. Today, an inconceivably large number of galaxies exist in the known universe, approximately 100 billion of them, by most estimates, many of which are similar in size and shape to our own Milky Way galaxy. To me, the most fascinating part of our cosmic story isn't the sheer number of galaxies, though. It's that these galaxies are not standing still. As time marches forward, the galaxies are expanding farther and farther away from one another. Time is a way of cataloging and labeling exactly when something happens relative to other things. As long as there are sequences of events to order, there will be time. Or, to put it another way, without a sequence of events that have a distinct past, present, and future, time wouldn't exist. When time became important. If you were around before the Industrial Revolution ended, in the early 1800s, you wouldn't have measured time down to the minute. Not only because you didn't have the technology to do so, but also because you didn't need to. Before the Industrial Revolution, measuring time wasn't as important, and most of us worked on the farm, where we had way fewer deadlines, meetings, and events to sequence than we have today. In fact, until the first mass-market machine-made watches were produced in the 1850s, timepieces were unattainable by pretty much anyone except for the super rich. And most of us charted the day's progression by looking at the sun. Because we didn't measure time with a clock, we would speak about events relative to other events. In the Malay language, there is even the phrase "pisan zapra," which roughly translates to about the time it takes to eat a banana. But by the mid-1800s, technology continued to accelerate, and a pivotal shift began to take place that made time a lot more relevant. Railroads began to expand across the United States and Canada, as well as across many other parts of the world. As they expanded, an interesting conundrum arose. No two cities kept the same time. After all, why would they? Time was consistent within each individual city, and since cities weren't connected to one another, there was no reason for two cities to sync up. As railroads continued to connect individual cities, though, there were often dozens of time zones in a single state, which led to all sorts of problems for the railroad companies. After several accidents and near misses, the railroads had finally had it and decided that the sun was no longer cutting it as a timekeeper. That's when, in 1883, railroad operators teamed up to define 4 simple time zones across the United States and Canada. These time zones were originally created for the railroads to use internally. To make matters even more complicated, up until 1883, the railroads themselves had 53 different time zones they used to track their trains. Across the United States and Canada, railroads switched to using just 4 time zones at exactly noon on November 18th, 1883. 35 years later, in 1918, the United States officially went from using hundreds of time zones to using just 4, and time zones were codified into federal law. I find this fascinating. Even though humans have been around for 200,000 years, we've only been living by the clock for the last 175. It's a good thing for time zones too. Try to imagine how difficult it would be to coordinate a meeting or get everyone in one place for an event if every city kept different time. In the early 1900s, around the same time the time zones were codified into law, we were in the midst of 2 other crucial shifts in North America. More and more people began working in factories, and labor unions across the United States began fighting for and winning shorter 8-hour workdays. Within the span of a few decades, we went from selling goods we produced ourselves to helping create mass-produced goods in factories, which also meant we began to trade our time for a paycheck. While time has been ticking on for billions of years, we only began measuring it down to the minute after the Industrial Revolution because we finally had a reason to. Time was money, and there was a direct correlation between how many minutes and hours we worked and how much we produced. We'd always worked for money, but it was in the factory era that how long we worked began to be exactly measured. Almost overnight, time management had become an essential part of living in a post-industrial world, and the time economy was born. Today, of course, you're already familiar with what happens next. In the same way that we went from working on farms to working in factories, since the 1950s, many of us have gone from working in factories to working in offices. Over the last 60 years, manufacturing in the United States went from accounting for 28% of the country's GDP to just 12%. And this shrinkage happened in the face of more and more automation. Over the same time period, the sector of the U.S. economy that has grown by far the most has been the professional and businesses services sector, a fancy name for the chunk of the economy that includes every single high-tech, engineering, legal, consulting, and accounting company. Companies like Apple, Google, Boeing, General Electric, McKinsey & Company, and Deloitte. As the manufacturing industry has wilted, Over the last 6 decades, this sector has tripled in size. When we transitioned into the time economy, we began to trade our time for a paycheck. But as we have transitioned into the knowledge economy, we've begun to trade so much more than just our time. Most people who work non-factory jobs trade some combination of their time, attention, energy, skills, knowledge, social intelligence, network, and ultimately, their productivity for a paycheck. Today, time is no longer money. Productivity is money. A crazy idea. This begs the question, what does time management look like in the knowledge economy? I'm going to present you with a crazy idea that will begin to make more and more sense the deeper we dive into this section of the book. If you want to become more productive, managing your time should take a back seat to how you manage your energy and attention. Don't get me wrong, time is still important. We don't live in some hocus-pocus world where time doesn't exist. But it's simply not as important as it once was when the majority of us worked in factories, where our traditional views of managing our time arose. Ever since there have been events to chronicle, time has ticked on, and there has been no way to stop it. For as long as we can predict, time will continue to tick on at the same rate. But what actually fluctuates on a day-to-day basis is how much energy and attention you have. In the knowledge economy, that's what makes or breaks how productive you are. And more important, it's something you can actually control. Time is a necessity of work and of nature. But as far as productivity is concerned, it should merely be the backdrop against which you work. Take, for example, the largest relic from the time economy, the 9-to-5 workday. In the time economy, the whole 9-to-5 idea made a lot of sense. We had a lot of machines and people to coordinate. Time was money, and running an efficient factory meant getting machines and employees in the same place at once. It made sense to pay people to work by the hour because the work performed by employees was not all that different from the work performed by machines. Today, when productivity is about what you accomplish and not how much you produce, a 9-to-5 workday makes as much sense as diligently tracking your time out on the farm. After all, what if your biological prime time falls when you're not working, and you have the most energy from 6 to 9 a.m., or from 7 to 11 p.m.? Or what if you have trouble focusing because you're trying to multitask on a million things at once? Or what if you're constantly bombarded by distractions and interruptions? Time is still important, and we likely won't go back to comparing how long something takes to eating a banana anytime soon. But today, time is just one part of 3 in the productivity equation. Working smarter. I find it fascinating that it's impossible to talk about managing your time without also talking about how you manage your attention and energy. If it sounds to you like I'm hitting the crack pipe, consider this notion. When we schedule time for something, what we're actually doing is simply deciding when we will invest our attention and energy into the task. That's where time management should fit into the productivity equation. Scheduling time for something is really just a way of creating attentional and energy boundaries around a task. And for that reason, your time, attention, and energy are inseparable. Managing your time becomes important only after you understand how much energy and focus you will have throughout the day and define what you want to accomplish. Unless you're an entrepreneur or a CEO, you likely don't have complete control over your time. If you work with more than one person, meetings are inevitable, and so is having to manage your time, at least to some extent. Since you don't have complete control over the sequence of events that make up your workday, and few do, it's essential that you carve out time for coordinating with other people. But unless you work in a factory, you at least have some modicum of control over your time and over what you work on. Some days I schedule my entire day, and I've found that doing so makes me incredibly productive, especially when I form a strong intention about what I'm going to get done. But I only ever plan out my day after I account for how much attention and energy I will have, and most important, what I intend to accomplish. During my project, I learned to work smarter instead of just harder. It has helped me accomplish things like narrate the very audiobook you're listening to right now. It's not that I'm smarter or more talented, it's that I learned the hard way how to step out of the time economy and into the knowledge economy to become more productive. Here are a few of the best ways I discovered to do that. Working less. Takeaway. When you work consistently long hours or spend too much time on tasks, that's usually not a sign that you have too much to do. It's a sign that you're not spending your energy and attention wisely. As one example, during my experiment to work 90-hour work weeks, I found that I accomplished only a bit more than when I worked 20-hour work weeks. Working 90-hour weeks. One of the most exciting parts of my project was that because I spent most of my time reading, researching, conducting interviews and experiments, and writing, technically speaking, I could work 168 hours every week, 24/7, if I really wanted to. My work could expand to accommodate how much or how little time I had for it. Aside from the pressure I put on myself to get a lot done every day, I had total freedom and flexibility for how long I worked, which made productivity experiments like working 90-hour weeks possible. By comparison, for most of my project, I worked an average of 46 hours a week. Before I started AYOP, whenever I had more work to do than I had time to do it in, which was pretty much all the time, I would usually put in longer hours so I could finish my tasks. When you feel like your to-do list is expanding faster than the universe is, working longer hours almost always feels like the best option to getting everything done. On the surface, it makes total sense. The longer you work, the more time you have to do everything in. But in practice, working longer hours means having less time to refocus and recharge, which leads to more stress and lower energy. That's what got me curious, especially as my work quickly began to pile up during my project. Is there a better and smarter way to getting everything done? Or is working longer hours simply the only option? Fortunately, I had created the perfect test environment to find out. To get to the bottom of the link between the number of hours spent working and productivity, I designed a productivity experiment to test out how my productivity was affected by working both insane hours and relaxed hours. For 4 weeks, I alternated between working 90 hours one week and 20 the next to see how working both extreme hours and shorter hours affected how much I got done every day. During the experiment, at the end of each day and week, I asked myself the same 3 questions. 1. How much energy and focus did I have left? 2. How easily was I distracted? And 3. Did I accomplish what I intended to? Every day and week, I also made a list of everything I accomplished so I could compare how my hours affected my productivity. As a science nerd, I have to say that this experiment was anything but scientific, but I quickly began to discover 2 big, surprising lessons from it. 2 huge lessons. After slogging through one 90-hour week and one 20-hour week, I quickly discovered something breathtaking when I was looking through my experiment logs. I accomplished only a bit more working 90-hour weeks than I did in my 20-hour weeks. This was easily one of the more surprising findings I made during my project. It went against everything I knew about productivity. I had always assumed that working longer hours gave you more time to accomplish everything you need to get done. On the surface, it made little sense, until I looked beyond how much time I invested in my work, and instead looked at how much energy and attention I invested in it. When I invested more time in my work during my insane weeks, my work became a lot less urgent. On a minute-by-minute basis, I invested less energy and focus into everything I intended to get done. But when I had a limited amount of time in my 20-hour weeks, I forced myself to expend significantly more energy and focus over that shorter period of time so I could get everything done I had to do. Of course, all the pressure I felt during this experiment came from me. I didn't have a boss, team, or any large looming deadlines around the corner. But the lesson is just as potent. By controlling how much time you spend on a task, you control how much energy and attention you spend on it. The second invaluable lesson I discovered from the experiment was that even though on paper I accomplished about the same in both long and short weeks, I felt twice as productive working longer hours. Even though I wasn't spending my attention or energy wisely, I sure as hell felt productive. It's hard not to feel productive when you're busy all day long, but busyness does not translate into productivity if it doesn't lead you to accomplish anything. Before I started my project, when I reflected on how productive I was at the end of each day and each week, I usually made a critical mistake. I looked at how busy I was instead of how much I accomplished. Productivity is an elusive idea. Because it's hard to get a handle on just how much you accomplish every day, looking at how busy you are is a quick, down and dirty, and usually inaccurate shortcut to seeing how productive you are. In the middle of my 20-hour weeks, I couldn't help but feel guilty that I wasn't as busy as I thought I should be. Because I was working a shorter amount of time, I perceived myself as less productive, and I became unnecessarily hard on myself because of it, even though I was spending a ton of energy and focus on what I had to get done, and I was accomplishing about the same amount of work. This is a trap almost all of us fall into. When you have more work to do than you have time to do it in, it's easy to trick yourself into thinking you have only two options: keep working a standard work week and fall behind, or begin putting in more hours to get everything done. But as I discovered during this experiment, there is a third, less obvious option that is much more powerful than spending more time on your work. Learn to invest more energy and attention into your work so you can get the same amount done in a fraction of the time. For important things, spend less time. When I worked 20-hour weeks, something magical began to happen. I forced myself to expend more energy over a shorter period of time so I could get my work done more quickly. When you limit how much time you spend on an important task, three things happen. One, you set an artificial deadline which motivates you to expend more energy and focus over a shorter period of time. Two, you create urgency around the task because you have a limited amount of time to get it done. And three, you flip some of the task's procrastination triggers because limiting the time you'll spend on a task makes it more structured and less boring, frustrating, and difficult. And when you also work on the task during your prime productive time, that's the sweet spot on the productivity racket. By the way, shrinking how long you'll work on the task is also a great way to warm up to difficult tasks that you're more likely to procrastinate on. For example, on days when I really don't feel like exercising or meditating, I simply shrink how long I'll meditate or exercise for in my head until I no longer feel resistance to it. For example, can I work out for an hour? I feel a lot of resistance to that. 30 minutes? Better, but still too much. What about 20 minutes? Perfect, I'll work out for 20 minutes. Shrinking a task works wonders every time. And the hack is helpful for forming new daily habits too. Plus, once you get started, chances are you'll want to keep going beyond your original point of resistance. After conducting this experiment, whenever I had an important article to write, speech to prepare, or project to crank out throughout the rest of the project, instead of scheduling an entire afternoon to work on the task, I scheduled just 2 or 3 hours for the task, usually smack dab in the middle of my biological prime time. And whenever I had a good handle on how much time, attention, and energy a task would take, I got it done. With a limited amount of time, I had no other choice. The exact number of hours you should work every week. If limiting how much time you spend on a task lets you get it done more efficiently, does the same rule apply for working fewer hours in general? Intriguingly, several studies suggest that it does. If you were to work just 1 hour a week, no matter how well you managed your energy and attention over that hour, you wouldn't be all that productive. 1 hour of work a week is simply not enough time to accomplish much of anything important. But your productivity also becomes shot when you work for too long. Working 90 hours a week for any longer than 1 week is a recipe for burnout. Doing so leaves you with hardly any time to recharge your energy levels and focus. Just as you can work too few hours, you can simply work too much. So where is the sweet spot for how many hours you should work every week? Over the course of my project, I settled into a nice equilibrium of working 46 hours a week, which was enough time for me to get everything done while taking needed breaks to recharge my energy levels and attention over the course of the day. But studies show that the ideal number of hours to work every week is even lower than that. They suggest that the optimal number is roughly 35 to 40 hours. On the surface, 35 to 40 hours seems low. When your to-do list is always longer than the number of hours you have in the day, you might feel guilty if you begin to work 40 hours a week, especially if the people around you continue to work 50, 60, or even more. But studies suggest that after roughly 35 or 40 hours, your productivity begins to plummet. In the short term, there are huge productivity gains to be had by working extra hours, particularly when deadlines are fast approaching. Sometimes there is simply a ton of work to do, and you need to dedicate more time to do that work. But in the long term, working longer hours is a recipe for disaster, especially when they lead you to have less time to cultivate your attention and energy, as I'll discuss in the next chapters. After 35 to 40 hours of work, studies show that your marginal productivity begins to drop until, quote, at approximately 8 60-hour weeks, the total work done is the same as what would have been done in 8 40-hour weeks, end quote. The same study found that with 70 and 80-hour weeks, you reach the same break-even point in just 3 weeks. In working 90 hours a week, I stumbled upon that break-even point in just 2 weeks, even though the 2 weeks were separated by a luxurious 20-hour week. But often, even in the short term, working longer hours can decrease your productivity. One study found that when you work 60-hour weeks, in order to accomplish 1 more hour of work, you need to work 2 hours of overtime. Yet another study found that your productivity, quote, falls off a cliff after 55 hours, so much so that someone who puts in 70 hours produces nothing more with those extra 15 hours, end quote. Beyond a certain point, you simply begin to do more busy work than important or meaningful work. You'll feel a lot less guilty, like I did when working 90 hours a week, but you'll also be a lot less productive. In the time economy, when work required a lot less energy and attention, there was a direct correlation between how many hours you worked and how much you produced. Working insane hours would have made you much more productive. Today, though, the equation has changed. Since your time, attention, and energy all contribute to your productivity, working long hours can destroy your productivity because doing so compromises your energy and focus. In the knowledge economy, the most productive people don't only manage their time well, they also manage their energy and attention well. Limiting how much time you spend on your work, whether on an important task or on your work in general, is a great way to spend your time, attention, and energy wisely. Depending on how much control you have over when you work, setting limits for how long you work in general, even reasonable limits like working for 35 hours, may not be realistic. But whenever possible, it's worth setting limits for how long you work, so you spend more energy on what you have to get done, not more valuable time. The Shrink Your Work Challenge. Time required, 1 minute. Energy and focus required, 4 out of 10. Value, 8 out of 10. Fun, 8.5 out of 10. What you'll get out of it. You'll learn to expend more energy and attention on your work to get things done in a fraction of the time. The challenge for this chapter is simple. Tomorrow, limit how much time you'll spend on an important task and stick to that limit. My favorite way to limit how much time I spend on something is to simply set a countdown timer on my phone for half of the amount of time I think a task will take. If I think I need 4 hours to crank out an important presentation, I'll schedule just 2, during my biological prime time if I can. This tactic won't work for every single item on your task list, but it works wonders on tasks that are important and that have a deadline that's fast approaching. Once you start limiting how much time you'll spend on specific tasks, my bet is that you'll also begin to limit how long you work in general. Consistently working for more than 35 or 40 hours a week makes you less productive over time because it leads you to make more mistakes and poorer decisions, both of which can take a lot of time to fix. It also causes you to miss new ideas, opportunities, shortcuts, and opportunities to work smarter instead of just harder. When you work consistently long hours or spend too much time on tasks, that's usually not a sign that you have too much to do. It's a sign that you're not spending your energy and attention wisely.